Hi, my name's Ann Haber, and today I'm going to demonstrate the anatomy of the respiratory system. So we're going to start with the upper respiratory tract. And the upper respiratory tract starts with the nasal cavity. This is the nasal cavity. The entrance to the nasal cavity is the nostril or the external nares. As the nasal cavity passes air through it, that air will pass into this area called the nasopharynx. And as it passes into the nasopharynx, this anatomical region right here is called the internal nares. So we've got the external nares, the internal nares as it passes into the nasopharynx. Okay, the internal nares is also called the posterior nasal aperture in some texts. So within the nasal cavity we have these ridges, and you would have learned these ridges actually as bones or processes of bones back in Bio 201. So in Bio 201 you learned that the ethmoid bone here has two processes that are called concha in singular, conchae in plural. Okay, so this would be the superior nasal concha. This would be the inferior nasal concha. Sorry, this would be the superior nasal concha. This would be the middle nasal concha. And then this you learned as a bone that was its own separate bone as the inferior nasal concha. And there are like grooves in between the conchae, so it's concha in singular, conchae in plural, okay? And the grooves are called hiatuses. So this would be the inferior nasal hiatus, the middle nasal hiatus, and the superior nasal hiatus. Now, we also have sinuses that surround the nasal cavity. And the sinuses that surround the nasal cavity are called paranasal sinuses. And they are named after the bones that they are in. So once again, you have to recall your anatomy of the bones back from Bio 201. Okay? So this is the frontal bone. And this is a sinus in the frontal bone, so therefore it is called the frontal sinus. Sinuses are mucous membrane-lined cavities in the bones. They serve to lighten the bones. They serve to humidify the air as the air is passing through our nasal cavity. And they give a certain resonance to our tone of voice. So this is named after the bone that it's in. This is the frontal bone, therefore this is the frontal sinus. In sagittal section, we also get a really nice view of this bone here. So recall from Bio 201 that this is the sphenoid bone. There's that sella turcica and the hypophyseal fossa. And this cavity here would be considered the sphenoid sinus. And there are more than one sinuses in the bones. So the other bones that you will find sinuses in are the bones that, of course, surround the nasal cavity. So here's the ethmoid bone, and here is the maxilla. But these bones are in sagittal section, and you cannot see the sinuses when you are getting a view of the sagittal section. So to see those bones, it would be better if we could take a frontal section of the nasal cavity. So here is a frontal section of the nasal cavity. This whole thing is the nasal cavity, okay? And this is a tooth that's in the mandible. This is a tooth that's in the maxilla. And look at these big sinus right above that tooth that's in the maxilla. So guess what? That's called the maxillary sinus. Okay? So this would be a nice frontal view of the maxillary sinus. Again, this is the nasal cavity. This is the inferior nasal concha, middle nasal concha, superior nasal concha, and those are both processes of the ethmoid bone. This is all ethmoid bone here. And so these cavities here, 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 those would be the ethmoid sinuses, and some texts will call them the ethmoid air cells. And you can also get a view of the paranasal sinuses by looking at disarticulated bones. So this is a disarticulated ethmoid bone, and as you can see, there are little tiny holes within that bone, and those would be the ethmoid sinuses or the ethmoid air cells. This is a sphenoid bone, a disarticulated sphenoid bone, looks like a butterfly, and these would be the sphenoid sinuses. Here is a maxilla. This is the right maxilla. Remember, the maxilla is a fused bone. So this is the right maxilla, and if we were to look, we would see that if you break into the maxilla, you would see these big cavities here, which are the maxillary sinuses, which again are these sinuses here. So these are structures associated with the oral cavity. The oral cavity you normally think of as part of the digestive system, but it's shared with the respiratory system up here in the upper respiratory tract. So this is the oral cavity, and the roof of the oral cavity is the same as the floor of the nasal cavity. And so the roof of the oral cavity and the floor of the nasal cavity are made up of two bones, the maxilla and the palatine bone. They're fused together, remember. So those two bones together make up the hard palate. And then posterior to the hard palate, you have some soft tissue back here, and that is the soft palate. And at the very end of the soft palate, you have this structure here, which is called the uvula. And the purpose of the uvula is to, as you swallow food, it sort of flips upward, and it occludes the passageway up to the nasal cavity. That passageway is called the nasopharynx, so that food ends up going down into the stomach like it's supposed to, instead of up into your nasal cavity, which it's not supposed to do, okay? So I've mentioned the word, the root pharynx a couple of times, and pharynx means throat. And there are three portions of the pharynx. One portion is at the posterior aspect of the nasal cavity, so we call that the nasopharynx. One portion of the pharynx is at the posterior aspect of the oral cavity. Here's the oral cavity. So we would call this the oropharynx. And the third portion of the pharynx is called the laryngopharynx. Okay? And it's called the laryngopharynx because it is posterior to the larynx. And the larynx goes from this structure here, this elastic cartilage here, called the epiglottis, down to just inferior to the cricoid cartilage. So this whole structure here is the larynx. And the superior portion of it is the epiglottis. And the epiglottis, the purpose of the epiglottis is as you swallow food, it moves downward like this, covering up the opening of the larynx. So that, again, the food goes down the esophagus as it's supposed to, and it doesn't end up going into the larynx, which is going to be part of your respiratory system, which would cause you to choke. Okay? So So from the oral cavity, we would move into the oropharynx, and inferior to the oropharynx and posterior to the larynx, we would see the laryngopharynx. So now we're going to talk about the larynx and then the lower respiratory tract. So you should recognize this bone from Bio 201. This is the hyoid bone. Inferior to the hyoid bone, we have some pretty significant looking cartilage here. This is called the thyroid cartilage, named after the thyroid gland, or maybe the thyroid gland is named after the thyroid cartilage. And then inferior to the thyroid cartilage is the cricoid cartilage. I'm not sure if you can see this or not, but maybe I'll take it this way. The cricoid cartilage goes all of the way around. It's hard to see because there's a muscle covering it here, but the cricoid cartilage goes all the way around the larynx, whereas the thyroid cartilage only goes partway around the larynx. So if we were to go inferior to the cricoid cartilage, we would then be in the trachea. And the trachea consists of these hyaline cartilage rings, along with some smooth muscle posteriorly. If we were to take a sagittal section of the larynx, we can get a pretty good shot of the vocal cords here. Okay, so we have true vocal cords and false vocal cords. So they're sometimes called vocal folds. So these are the true vocal cords, and they are superior to, these are the false vocal cords, and they are superior to the true vocal cords, which are inferior. Just to get you oriented back in this sagittal section again, this is the epiglottis. It is made of elastic cartilage, and that is what flops downward and covers up the opening to the larynx so that food cannot pass into the larynx. This would be the cricoid cartilage, and in sagittal section you can see that it goes all of the way around the larynx. This would be cricoid cartilage, and this would be cricoid cartilage. And then inferior to that, we're in the trachea. The trachea, again, consists of hyaline cartilage rings, cartilaginous rings, and as it moves inferiorly, it will branch into the left and right primary bronchus, sometimes it's called main stem bronchus, sometimes they are called, or main bronchus. So this would be the left and right primary bronchi, or the left and right main stem bronchi. And they are going to enter into the lungs in a depressed area, a medial area of the lungs that has somewhat of a depression in it. And that depression is referred to as the hilum or the hilus. Now, there's a collection of structures in the hilum. The main bronchi, or the primary bronchi, in this case bronchus, because I'm just demonstrating on the left side. And notice these are vessels that we've seen before. Okay, we learned these back in the cardiovascular system. This vessel is carrying deoxygenated blood to the lungs, so it must be the pulmonary artery. This is, these are blood vessels carrying oxygenated blood back towards the heart, so those must be the pulmonary veins. Okay, remember, in the pulmonary circuit, arteries and veins are different with respect to whether they're carrying oxygenated or deoxygenated blood. And that whole collection of structures as a group is called the root of the lung. Okay, so you've got the hilus, and you've got the primary bronchus and the pulmonary arteries and veins. entering into the lungs at that point, and that whole collection of structures is referred to as the root of the lung. Notice that we have lobes of the lungs, okay? And the left lung has two lobes, superior and inferior. And the right lung has three lobes, superior, middle, inferior. And as a nurse, you will be listening to breath sounds in different lung fields, and you'll be reporting on the sounds that you hear in certain lobes. Okay? So the primary bronchi then will branch into bronchi that go into the lungs. Since there are three bronchi, or three lobes in the right lung, we have three branches that come off the right primary bronchus. And the bronchi that the primary bronchus branches into is called a secondary bronchus. It's also called a lobar bronchus because it's going into the lobes. So since there's three lobes on the right side, we've got three lobar bronchi on the right side. The left side only has two lobes, so we have two lobar or two secondary bronchi on the left side. We can also see in this model, let's remember that the base of the lungs is the wide part, and this tip of the lungs up here, they're roughly shaped like a triangle, so just like in geometry, this is the base of the triangle, this is the apex of the triangle, this would be the apex of the lung, and the base of the lung. The base of the lung sits upon the diaphragm. So remember, the diaphragm is that bowl-shaped muscle. This is diaphragm. And the base of the lungs sit on the central tendon of the diaphragm, so that when the diaphragm contracts, we can actually pull down on the bases of the lungs and make the lungs bigger so that they can take in more air. There are some openings in the diaphragm that things need to pass through, and the openings are named after the things that pass through them. Now, we don't have the thing here in this opening, but this opening right here would be the opening for the inferior vena cava. So this is called the vena caval foramen. This is the esophagus, and it passes through the esophageal hiatus. And this, you will recall, is the portion of the descending aorta that is referred to as the thoracic aorta. And it passes kind of behind the diaphragm. So the aorta passes behind the diaphragm in this depression right here, and it is called the aortic hiatus. Okay, let's go ahead and review the pericardium and also demonstrate the pleura on this section here, which is a transverse section. So you need to imagine that you've cut yourself in a transverse section right about through the, maybe about 4 inches above your diaphragm or so. That's where this section would be. Okay, so just to get, so remember, we've cut you in half transversely. So you have the right lung here, the left lung here. This is the heart, right ventricle, left ventricle, interventricular septum, apex of the heart pointing towards the left. Okay, recall that the serous membranes that surrounded the heart were called pericardium, around the heart, pericardium. And the membrane that sat right on top of the surface of the heart was called visceral pericardium. And the membrane that formed the outer portion of the pericardial sac was called the parietal pericardium. Visceral pericardium, and parietal pericardium. And you can use the same language when you talk about the pleural cavity, or the cavity that surrounds the lungs. It also is made of serous membranes. And there is a serous membrane that is right on top of the surface of the lung, and that would be called visceral pleura. Visceral pleura, right on top of the surface of the lung. And then the membrane that forms the exterior of the pleural cavity is called parietal pleura. Parietal pleura. And within the pleural cavity, we have some serous fluid called, not surprisingly, pleural fluid. So let's take a look at that in frontal section as well. Okay, so here we have the trachea bifurcating or branching into the right primary bronchus and the left primary bronchus. We know that the primary bronchi are going to branch into secondary bronchi, which are also called lobar bronchi. Okay, so the secondary bronchi are going to go into the lobes of the lungs. Let's remember that the left side has 2 lobes and the right side has 3 lobes. Okay, so the primary bronchus should branch into 3 secondary bronchi on the right. In a flat section like this, though, you only see 2. Okay, so we see the primary bronchus branching into a secondary bronchus and a secondary bronchus, and the other one is back in a plane that we can't see. Okay, and then the secondary bronchi branch into tertiary bronchi. Okay, so a secondary bronchus branches into a tertiary bronchus. A secondary bronchus branches into a tertiary bronchus. From here, the bronchi get smaller and smaller. They begin to lose their hyaline cartilage and get more and more smooth muscle, until finally we are in very small airways called bronchioles. Okay, so we'll come over here and look at the bronchioles in a second, but let's go ahead and retake a look back here at the pleura on this model. Okay, so let's remember that the pleural cavity is formed by serous membranes. The serous membranes either sit directly on the surface of the lung or form the outside of the pleural cavity. So here we would see parietal pleura forming the exterior of the pleural cavity. And the visceral pleura would be sitting right directly on the lung surface itself. And then in between, we would see the pleural cavity filled with pleural fluid. Another reminder over here is to take a look at the intercostal muscles. And remember that we have external intercostal muscles and internal intercostal muscles. On a frontal section like this, you can definitely see, okay, this intercostal muscle is more towards the surface, so that must be the external intercostal muscle. And this intercostal muscle is more towards the interior, so that must be the internal intercostal muscle. Those are muscles of respiration, and the diaphragm also is a muscle of respiration. So let's go back to these smaller airways. So the bronchi get smaller and smaller. They lose their cartilage. They start to have more smooth muscle, and at that point, they are becoming microscopic. You would not be able to see them unless you did a section through the lung and you sent it off to histology to be stained and mounted. So once we get down to that level, we're microscopic, but on this model, of course, this looks huge. This is something that we wouldn't be able to see in this detail with our eyes. If you saw a section of the lung, it would just look like a blank space of air, okay, because that's what it is. This is basically a sac of air, okay. So the bronchi get smaller and smaller until they become bronchioles, okay, and there are many, 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 many bronchioles within the lungs. And when you're in lecture, you'll talk about the sections of the airway that conduct air down to the lower sections of the lung, and that's called the conductive zone. The conductive zone ends at what's called the terminal bronchiole. Okay, so the terminal bronchiole, surrounded by smooth muscle, and it does not have any air sacs attached to it. Okay, and those air sacs, in plural, are called alveoli. In singular, one of these grape-like structures is called an alveolus. A terminal bronchiole does not have an alveolus or any alveoli coming off of it. But a terminal bronchiole will branch into respiratory bronchioles, which do have alveoli hanging off of them. Okay, so these would be respiratory bronchioles, giving rise to, again, the structure that will be surrounded by the alveolar sac, okay, and that would be called the alveolar duct. So the respiratory bronchiole gives rise to the alveolar duct, and surrounding the alveolar duct, you would have an alveolar sac, and the alveolar sac contains many, many alveoli, in plural, alveolus, in singular, and that is actually where your gas exchange occurs.